When former President Donald Trump sat down with Vladimir Putin in their most recent meeting on the 15th of August 2025, headlines swirled with speculation. Were they discussing Ukraine, nuclear weapons, energy deals? Few stopped to consider a deeper truth. Every time America and Russia lock eyes, the shadow of Alaska lingers in the background. Separated from Russia by just 55 miles of icy water across the Bering Strait, Alaska has always been more than mountains and snow. It's a chess piece on the board of global power, a frontier where empires have collided and where the fate of nations has often been tested. But to understand why Alaska matters today, we need to trace its history back thousands of years to the first footsteps on frozen ground. Long before any mapmaker traced its outline, Alaska was home. Over 10,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, the Bering Land Bridge connected Siberia and North America. From Asia, waves of people migrated across, following herds of mammoths and caribou. They became the ancestors of Alaska's indigenous peoples, the Inupiat and Yupik of the north, the Aleut of the islands, the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian of the southeast. These societies thrived in what outsiders saw as desolation. They built complex cultures rooted in the rhythms of the land and sea. Whales, seals, salmon, and caribou were more than food. They were the pillars of belief, art, and survival. Totem poles told stories of ancestry. Ceremonies celebrated cycles of abundance and scarcity. For thousands of years, Alaska wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was a flourishing world of its own. That world changed in the mid-1700s, when Russian explorers pushed east across Siberia. In 1741, Vitus Bering's expedition sighted Alaska's coast, and the fur trade soon followed. To the Russian Empire, Alaska wasn't land. It was a resource, its sea otters and foxes offering some of the finest pelts in the world. The Russian-American company established outposts, trading with and often exploiting native communities. Missionaries brought Orthodox Christianity, blending it with indigenous practices in ways still visible today. But for Russia, Alaska was always more outpost than homeland. It was distant, costly to defend, and vulnerable. In 1867, Secretary of State William H. Seward struck a deal with Russia, $7.2 million for Alaska. Critics mocked it as Seward's folly, a frozen wasteland of ice and emptiness. Newspapers joked about buying polar bears and glaciers, but time would prove the critics wrong. Gold, oil, and strategic position would make Alaska one of America's greatest bargains. Still, in the years immediately after the purchase, it was more curiosity than asset. Few settlers moved north. Indigenous communities continued their lives, often with little interference from Washington. Yet beneath the snow, the seeds of future wealth and conflict lay waiting. Think about it. In less than 2 centuries, Alaska had shifted from being a land of self-sufficient native nations to a Russian fur colony to an American possession. Each wave of power saw something different in it: resources, territory, or strategy. And through it all, Alaska's indigenous peoples endured, adapting and resisting in equal measure. What outsiders once dismissed as barren wilderness was in fact one of the most valuable crossroads on Earth. A crossroads that would only grow in importance as the world hurtled toward the modern age. When the United States purchased Alaska in 1867, most Americans shrugged. To them, it was a barren wasteland at the edge of nowhere. But that perception changed overnight with a single word: gold. In 1896, prospectors struck gold in the Klondike region of the Yukon, just across the Alaskan border. News raced south, and by 1897, tens of thousands of men, and some women, poured into Alaska. They carried dreams of striking it rich, but most found only hardship. Trails like the Chilkoot Pass were littered with abandoned equipment, frozen bodies, and dashed hopes. Yet the gold rush transformed Alaska forever. Towns like Skagway and Nome sprang to life almost overnight, filled with saloons, merchants, and gamblers. The economy exploded as businesses supplied miners with everything from pickaxes to whiskey. And while only a lucky few struck real fortunes, the influx of people forced Washington to pay more attention to its northern frontier. The U.S. Army established forts, law enforcement expanded, and federal control tightened. Alaska, once dismissed as a remote outpost, was rapidly becoming integrated into the American story. But there was a darker side. For Alaska's native peoples, the gold rush brought disease, displacement, and violence. Miners cut through hunting grounds, disrupted fishing streams, and claimed lands that had sustained communities for millennia. Traditional lifeways were undermined as waves of outsiders imposed new laws, religions, and economic systems. Mission schools sought to replace native languages with English, suppressing cultural identity. While some indigenous Alaskans adapted by trading with settlers or guiding expeditions, many found themselves marginalized in their own homeland. Despite the hardships, the gold rush laid the foundation for Alaska's modernization. Railroads and steamships made travel faster, while telegraph lines stitched Alaska more tightly into global communications. The promise of resources, gold, copper, and later oil, drew industries northward. By the early 20th century, Alaska was no longer just an exotic curiosity. It was an economic frontier. American newspapers no longer mocked Seward's folly. They hailed it as a land of opportunity. But Alaska's true strategic value wouldn't be revealed until the storm clouds of the Second World War. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Alaska suddenly sat on the front line of the Pacific War. In 1942, Japanese forces invaded the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, marking the only occupation of U.S. soil during the war. The Aleutian campaign was brutal. Fog, storms, and freezing winds made combat as deadly as bullets. Many soldiers never saw the enemy but perished from exposure, disease, or accidents. For Alaska natives, the war brought devastation. The U.S. military forcibly evacuated entire Aleut villages, relocating families to makeshift camps, where many died from disease and neglect. Their homes and churches were looted or destroyed, leaving scars that lasted generations. Yet, out of tragedy, Alaska's importance became undeniable. Airfields and bases were constructed, turning the territory into a vital hub for defense. The famous Alaska-Siberia Lend-Lease route ferried American planes through Alaska to support the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. Once again, Alaska stood at the crossroads of empires, this time as a lifeline in the fight against fascism. By the war's end in 1945, Alaska was no longer an overlooked territory. It had proven its worth both economically and militarily. Roads, ports, and airfields remained, providing infrastructure that would accelerate future growth. Veterans who had served there returned home with stories of Alaska's rugged beauty and strategic value, fueling calls for statehood. But Alaska was still caught in tension. Was it merely a resource colony for the United States, or could it stand as an equal among the states? That question would dominate the next chapter of its history. The end of World War II didn't bring peace to Alaska. It brought a new role on the global stage. With the rise of the Cold War, Alaska transformed from a remote territory into one of America's most strategic frontiers. By the 1950s, Alaskans were demanding equality. They had fought, bled, and sacrificed in defense of the nation, yet remained a territory without full representation. The war had proven Alaska's value, and its people wanted recognition. The push for statehood was fierce. Proponents argued that Alaska's resources, fish, timber, and minerals, should benefit its residents, not just outside corporations. Opponents, however, feared the costs of admitting such a vast and sparsely populated land. But in 1959, after years of political battles, Alaska became the 49th state of the United States. Fireworks lit the skies of Anchorage and Juneau as Alaskans celebrated their long-awaited inclusion in the Union. For the first time, they had full voting rights and a voice in Congress. Statehood could not have come at a more dramatic time. As tensions escalated with the Soviet Union, Alaska's location, just 55 miles from Russia across the Bering Strait, made it a front line in the nuclear standoff. The U.S. military built sprawling bases, radar stations, and missile sites across the state. The DEW line, distant early warning, stretched across the Arctic, a network of radar outposts designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers. Thousands of soldiers and technicians rotated through Alaska, bracing for a war that, thankfully, never came. For ordinary Alaskans, the Cold War was ever present. Sirens and drills reminded children that nuclear conflict was not just a distant threat, it could arrive on their doorstep. Fighter jets scrambled to intercept Soviet aircraft testing U.S. defenses. The skies above Alaska became a shadow battlefield, a place where superpowers probed each other's resolve without open war. If the Cold War gave Alaska strategic importance, oil gave it economic power. In 1968, one of the largest oil fields in North America was discovered at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's North Slope. The find was transformative. Suddenly, Alaska was not just America's northern outpost, it was an energy powerhouse. But there was a problem: how to move the oil from the Arctic coast to markets thousands of miles away. The solution was bold: the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, TAPS, an 800-mile engineering marvel stretching from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez. Construction began in 1974 and quickly became one of the most ambitious projects in U.S. history. Thousands of workers poured into Alaska, swelling boomtowns overnight. Engineers designed ingenious solutions to challenges: elevated pipes to prevent melting permafrost, special supports to withstand earthquakes, and heated stations to keep oil flowing in sub-zero temperatures. By the time the pipeline was completed in 1977, Alaska had been transformed. Oil revenues flowed into state coffers, funding schools, roads, and infrastructure. In 1982, the state even created the Permanent Fund, ensuring that every resident would share in the oil wealth through yearly dividend checks. Yet the oil boom came with costs. The rapid influx of money and workers disrupted communities, fueled inflation, and deepened social challenges. Indigenous groups, whose lands and waters bore the brunt of development, fought for recognition and compensation. Their efforts culminated in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, which returned millions of acres of land to Native corporations and provided nearly $1 billion in compensation. It was one of the largest land settlements in U.S. history, reshaping Alaska's legal and cultural landscape. At the same time, environmental disasters exposed the dangers of dependence on oil. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 dumped millions of gallons of crude into Prince William Sound, devastating fisheries, wildlife, and coastal communities. The haunting images of oil-soaked seabirds and poisoned waters became a grim reminder that Alaska's riches came at a price. By the end of the 20th century, Alaska was a land of contradictions. It was rich yet fragile, modern yet wild, American yet distinctly its own. Oil had given it prosperity and power, but also tied its fate to global markets and environmental risk. It remained a Cold War sentinel, but also a home to ancient cultures fighting to preserve traditions in a rapidly changing world. The state's identity was still being forged, not just as America's frontier, but as a place where the stakes of modern civilization collided with the raw forces of nature. And as the Cold War thawed, another challenge loomed. How would Alaska adapt to the new century when its environment, resources, and strategic position were once again drawing the eyes of the world? As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Alaska once again found itself at the crossroads of history. No longer just America's remote frontier, it had become a stage where some of the greatest challenges of our time, climate change, global politics, and cultural survival, were being played out in real time. Nowhere on Earth is the reality of climate change more visible than in Alaska. Temperatures here are rising at more than twice the global average. Glaciers that once towered for millennia are retreating. Sea ice, which indigenous communities have relied on for hunting and travel, is vanishing. Entire villages are being forced to relocate as coastal erosion and rising seas swallow the land. Traditional hunting and fishing cycles are being disrupted, threatening food security and cultural traditions. Scientists describe Alaska as the canary in the coal mine for global climate change. a place where the future arrives first. Yet, paradoxically, as the ice melts, new opportunities emerge. Shipping lanes are opening across the Arctic, cutting thousands of miles off global trade routes. Untapped oil, gas, and mineral reserves are becoming more accessible, sparking a scramble among world powers eager to stake claims in the far north. Which brings us back to Alaska's old role as a strategic frontier. Once again, the state is on the front lines of great power competition. Across the Bering Strait, Russia is rebuilding its Arctic bases and deploying nuclear submarines. China, though not an Arctic nation, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing heavily in polar research and shipping. For the United States, Alaska is the anchor of its Arctic presence. Military bases, radar systems, and missile defense installations remain critical to national security. In recent years, U.S. leaders, including Donald Trump, have even flirted with bold ideas, such as buying Greenland, a reminder that the Arctic is no longer a frozen backwater, but a hotbed of 21st century geopolitics. The recent meeting between Trump and Vladimir Putin once again highlighted how Alaska, sitting just across from Russia, is inseparably tied to these global conversations. In an age of renewed great power rivalry, the state's location makes it one of America's most valuable, yet vulnerable assets. But beyond geopolitics, there is another Alaska story, one of cultural endurance and renewal. Alaska Native peoples, who have lived on this land for thousands of years, continue to fight for their rights, language, and traditions. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 was only the beginning. Since then, Native corporations, villages, and tribal councils have been asserting greater control over resources and governance. Language revitalization programs are teaching children the tongues their grandparents were punished for speaking. Traditional arts, dances, and ceremonies are flourishing again, even as modern life reshapes Native communities. This duality, the blending of ancient traditions with modern challenges, gives Alaska a cultural richness found nowhere else in America. It is not just a frontier of land and resources, but of identity and resilience. So where does Alaska go from here? Its economy still depends heavily on oil, but the future may lie in renewable energy, tourism, and technology. Its wilderness remains one of the last great untouched landscapes on Earth, yet is constantly under pressure from development. The decisions made here, in Anchorage boardrooms, in Washington, D.C., in native villages, and in global climate summits, will shape not just Alaska's destiny, but the future of the Arctic and perhaps the world. Because Alaska is not just a state, it is a warning and a promise, a place where the clash between humanity and nature is laid bare, where cultures both ancient and modern seek balance, and where global powers test their strength at the top of the world. And so, the history of Alaska is still being written by the people who live here, by the forces of nature that shape it, and by the geopolitics that surround it. If you've enjoyed this journey through Alaska's past and present, and you want to explore more stories like this, about the histories of nations, cities, and continents, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It not only helps us bring you more in-depth history documentaries, but it also ensures you'll never miss the next chapter in our shared human story. After all, history doesn't just live in the past, it lives in the choices we make today.